Welcome to Purdue University's Dawn or Doom event. I am pleased to introduce Fabian Winkler, Associate Professor of Visual and Performing Arts, and Shannon McMullen, Assistant Professor of Visual and Performing Arts and American Studies. They collaboratively engage issues in contemporary culture through aesthetic strategies at the intersection of art, technology, and social inquiry. Today, they will present Just Looking, Motivations and Mechanisms for Machine Vision in the 21st Century.
And directly following them will be Eugenio Culurciello, Associate Professor of the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering and an Associate Professor of Psychological Sciences in the College of Health and Human Sciences. Joining him is Alfredo Canziani, Research Assistant pursuing a PhD at the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering. Their talk will be titled Visual Intelligence and the Terminator. Just please take a moment to silence all of your electronic devices. Thanks for coming again, and enjoy.
So thank you for that kind introduction. Am I on? I've been told that I need to use my theater voice and reach the back of the room so that you can all hear me. So if I get too quiet, then somebody in the back just raise their hand. So thank you for that wonderful introduction, and we are pleased to be here today and be a part of this interesting symposium at Purdue University. We just want to say at the beginning to frame the talk that we use the invitation to participate in this to start a new project, part of which you can see out in the hallway outside, the screen that you can change the vision algorithm to see what's going on. We'll explain that as we're going through the talk. But a project that's about machine vision and about looking using algorithms. So I mention this because what we're presenting to you today is not a finished product by any means, but our process in moving towards an art project and working collaboratively with Eugenio and with Alfredo in machine vision. We wanted to begin by explaining our artistic approach to projects such as these. The kind of art that Fabian and I engage in is often not what people think of when they hear the term visual art. And so we wanted to introduce you to a couple of projects that we have done in the past. The first one is Waves, which was shown in 3 different venues over a year in Germany, Canada, and South Korea. What you can see here is the setup in Germany. It consists of 3 different buoys. Those buoys were custom retrofitted, fabricated, in order to be able to translate water waves into sound waves. And so these are electronically generated sounds. Each buoy had its own sound. As you move it on the water, it was generating a kind of music, if you will. This is the Toronto setup at a project that was called Wade Toronto that took place in wading pools across the city. As you can see, our audience for this project was slightly smaller and slightly more interactive. Because of the wading pool situation, we had kids really working collaboratively to make sounds come out of those buoys. The final installation, and the reason for showing this image, is that you can see it takes a different form yet again in Seoul, Korea, for a New Media Arts International Festival. And what I want to point out in this particular image is that here we can see an interest that we have in using art and design to create social spaces, spaces around which people can gather and interact with art, and in this case, perhaps ask some questions about the relationship between sound and technology. And that theme will come back. A second project that shows, again, some of these themes, particularly here, carrying across the theme of social space, is National Security Garden, which was shown first in Singen, Germany. And in this case, what we have is an attempt to find new images and metaphors for contemporary technological interventions in nature. And the garden that you see, this is again at the Purdue version, right outside Elliott Hall, consisted of a box planted with a very familiar crop to this area of the United States, soybeans. but presented in a new way in order to ask questions again about nature, art, and technology. The solar tower that you see fueled LED lights. Those LEDs are made up of red and blue LEDs. Red and blue light waves are the most beneficial light waves for plant growth up to a certain point. At some point, too much might be harmful to the plant, and that was the kind of visual metaphor that we were interested in playing with in order to provoke questions and discussion. So you can see very clearly here with this image that the lighting at night, as the sun went down, the lights came up and the plants turned from green to magenta, a very artificial color for a plant, yet made from something that is somewhat natural, light, again, to be a kind of a metaphor. After that project, as that project was taking place, we were doing a lot of looking in farm magazines at advertisements to understand the way that relationships between nature and technology were represented in the field of farming. And this is an image that stuck in our head, a corn herbicide with the work ethic of a machine. So the idea that you could have machines picking the weeds out of gardens, right? That there was something about machines being able to do this work for humans that would be desirable. Well, this, as you can imagine, sparked all kinds of conversation between the two of us and our imagination. And so a project that's currently under development is called the Algorithmic Gardener. And there we have the science and machine vision interacting with the cultural concept of weeds. And we would like to attempt to visualize these relationships as aesthetic, as garden outcomes, asking questions about how do you teach a machine to see a weed, and what is a weed anyway? Because a weed is a very cultural concept. And starting to imagine what that might look like to a machine. These are imagined images of what a machine might see. This is ragweed. This is pretty generally defined here as a weed. But if you think about dandelions in your garden, if you have 2 or 3, they're probably a flower that you like. If you have 1 million like we have in our lawn, then they might be something that's a weed. It's not a category that's stable, and it's one that we're very interested in understanding. If you can turn these cultural concepts into an algorithm, what are the consequences of that? That brings us to the conversation about just looking, which is the topic of the new project. Should I go old school and read that little? Okay. All right. I'm going to go old school and actually read from a book here in this high technology conference that we're having. And the book that I'm reading from is by an art historian. His name is James Elkins. He's at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And he writes very frequently about topics related to visual culture. And this particular book is called The Object Stares Back. And he's writing in a reflective tone. He says, "When I say just looking, I mean I am searching. I have my eye out for something. Looking is hoping, desiring, never just taking in light, never merely collecting patterns and data. Looking is possessing, or the desire to possess. We eat food, we own objects, and we possess bodies. And there is no looking without thoughts of using, possessing, repossessing, owning, fixing, appropriating, keeping, remembering, and commemorating, cherishing, borrowing, and stealing. I cannot look at anything, any object, any person, without the shadow of the thought of possessing that thing. Those appetites don't just accompany looking, they are looking itself." And so he's very much talking about looking from a human perspective, and the idea that looking is never innocent, that it also contains actions, that it motivates, that we are interested in connecting looking to doing. And I think it's a very provocative kind of paragraph to think about what happens as we transition from human looking to machines looking. And with that, then Fabian would like to provide us with another image.
Yes, so in 1946, American abstract painter Ed Reinhardt created a series of comic strips, one of the plates we're seeing here, that investigates the idea of looking, of seeing in the context of contemporary art at the time. So we see this gentleman pointing at the picture saying, haha, what does this represent? Obviously having no clue how to even start an interpretation of that abstract painting, but then the painting answering back to him saying, what do you represent? Inferring that you actually need to have a certain kind of cultural context in which to see, in this case, contemporary art. But what we would like to extend this to is in which to see images in the world around us. And so this is what Ed Reinhardt also tries to say in this little paragraph underneath. The comic strip and abstract painting will react to you if you react to it. You get from it what you bring to it. So that you have to have a certain kind of cultural understanding of these images, which is, so to say, for us, the starting point also for looking at computer vision systems, because we think that this might be true in that context as well. So how does this translate now into a technological system? If you look at machine vision, of course, by looking at the world around such a system, the system is trying to make sense of what it sees. So what does this represent is a question that the machine might ask as well. And we argue actually also in our discussions that we had with Eugenio and with Alfredo, that it is not necessarily only a technical feat that you need to accomplish. You also need to have a certain kind of cultural understanding of these images that are being evaluated, that are being analyzed, that are being generated by these systems. And some of these images are not even being seen by humans ever at all. So to a certain extent, you need to have a kind of a language of these images, a language that these images speak, and you need to be able to speak this language if you want to criticize these images, if you want to critically respond to them, or in the end, if you even want to shape the direction in which the field of computer vision is going. In our visual research for the project, we found this picture. It's a movie poster advertising Dziga Vertov's film, The Man with the Movie Camera, a masterpiece of Russian avant-garde cinema from the 1920s. And we were struck by the visual similarity even of this camera that you see here compared to the setup that you see outside of our own artistic prototype installation. But at the same time, also pointing out here that Dziga Vertov established a language of cinema, a cinematic language with this film that, for example, introduced new concepts to our culture, our visual culture, such as the idea of continuity and montage, for example, of editing, of shot and counter shot, creating fictional realities through temporal montage. And then, of course, as an extension of that, in the 1970s, 1960s, we see the start of a new field, the field of visual culture. And one of the protagonists, one of the authors that we're looking at in this context is John Berger, who in 1972 created a 4-part movie series on BBC where he basically looked and critiqued images in a contemporary sense. Basically critiquing the traditional Western culture of looking at images, raising questions about hidden ideologies that are stored in images that he believed weren't discussed or weren't brought to the foreground before. And so we see this in a couple of different scenarios. He starts out talking about the context in which we see images, that some of the context has been removed from images, especially as they travel through time. We see this in, for example, representations of power and representations of societal status, for example, through the use of oil painting in one of the episodes. And then one episode is specifically about representation and gender, and basically making the point that only very few of the old masters were truly interested in representing a female form or a female shape, but more interested in representing a specifically male gaze, a gendered gaze on the subject that is being depicted in these images. Do you want to continue with the next set? Yes.
I'll continue.
Which is a good segue.
Yeah. And so John Berger becomes an influence on people like Marita Sturken and Lisa Cartwright, who have a book called Practices of Looking, an Introduction to Visual Culture. A new edition has come out in 2009. And I mention this book because the segue is from art history looking at artistic images to visual culture looking at images more broadly. And I think that is the kind of interface between art and science that we're interested in here, is thinking about images broadly, not just the artistic images. And so that brings me to a recent discussion of stock image databases. So databases that are used primarily for advertisers. So these are posed pictures, of course, but at hairpin.com, so artists have been taking a look at these databases and asking questions about what kind of cultural values are embedded within these databases. And here they labeled this one, I think, women laughing alone with salad. So, yes, how many women in here, when you eat your salad, you do this, you know? And how many of you do it on the beach, you know, really? And so it's a great extreme example of how images create certain assumptions about the world or represent the world in particular ways. And those are the kinds of questions that we are very much interested in as we move to machine vision, because machine learning, as we learned, is very dependent on image databases, right? So large quantities of images that are needed to train the machines. And so what happens when you move from this example that is particularly easy now to see because somebody has parsed it for us, to one in which you have large sets of images that are seemingly mundane, right? But contain, for sure, within them interesting cultural values and assumptions. And we ask questions about gender, but we could be asking them also about race and religion and war as well. And so we're very interested in trying to understand how human values are influencing our scientific and our technological sort of development. And so images are a place that we can see art and science coming together and asking questions. I'm going to tell you that I just got the 5-minute mark. We have to be a little speedier here. And so I think what we'll do then is to move quickly to the project. We'll leave Breadcamp out for now. So we call this project, the talk's called Just Looking, but the project we're interested in calling it 20X, and there we're playing on the idea of 2020, right? 2020 vision as a measure and a metaphor. With the expression 20X, we're asking how will we measure and express seeing clearly in the context of complex computer vision systems. So when we talk about 2020 now as perfect human vision, we mean that biologically and metaphorically we can see the world clearly in terms of history and relationships. I'll let Fabian, do you want to take over from there?
I can talk about the setup. So if you have some time after the talk, and I know it's going to be hard because our president is going to be on stage here with James Barrett, but maybe after that talk, if you go outside, you see an actual physical setup of this piece, which we still consider an early prototype, but that we see as an artifact that came out of the lab, out of the studio, as an experimental piece for interested people to experiment with the process of computer vision and to experience not so much the final classification of these systems. So this is usually what we know and what we probably have experienced. You know, we see these systems pointing out, now we see a tree, now we see a car, and we can say, yes, that is true, or no, it's not true. But to go one step before that final classification and take a look at the actual process, the many different layers that are necessary internally in the system to make sense of images and to compare what it sees to a set of images from a database that it was trained with. So we have this setup where a screen is mounted on a tripod, very similar to Giga Vertov's movie poster, but you have the opportunity now, using a little camera that's on top of the screen, to interactively swivel on the tripod and to actually point the camera at frames of interest, and then use knobs in order to overlay a computer-generated image that actually represents the vision process, the attempt to make sense of what it sees on top of a live video image. You can further also navigate through the depth of the network with another little knob, and each setting, each layer of this network depth that you can navigate also has feature maps that you can, and Alfredo is much better in talking about this than I, and he will probably do so, but it has feature maps that you can also explore with the third knob. So it basically really allows you to fine-tune and tweak the settings of this computer vision system, not with the aim of what we very often see to get a final classification, but with the aim, hopefully, to at least trying to attempt a little bit better and to see with your eyes the images that would be generated internally in such a system, and learning about how that system is generating an understanding or a representation of the world around us. And let's just skip forward a little bit. This will be the visual representation on the screen with sliders representing the position of the knobs that you can use in order to navigate the system and explore the system. This is actually Alfredo, our next speaker already, announcing him, plugging him here right on stage already, and demonstrating the system in his lab actually. But you can now interact with the system yourself, and hopefully with us being there, ask questions and get a hand-on experience, but also learn a little bit more about the theory behind such a system.
Yeah, maybe as like the absolute very quick sum up. So I think what we hope that we have been trying to convey is the opportunity for interdisciplinary collaboration between art and science and technology as a way to bring some of these technologies at an early stage out of the lab into the public in a form that ask questions that are socially and culturally relevant and give us an opportunity to discuss them. And we see Purdue as a site where this is a great place to do that because we have all of these disciplines represented right here. So, thank you.
Thank you.